that point?
I cannot recall, but they were commanding officers while I was speaking about. Uniformed commanding officers.
That's who you were, how many people in general were around the area, if you know?
I don't know.
Is there a mixture of a lot of law enforcement officers and civilians?
There was no civilians. I wouldn't describe it as a lot. I just would, maybe a couple of uniformed officers or commanding officers that were either from that 3rd Division, which is where the incident occurred, or a part of the CID.
You know that there was a large presence immediately after the shooting occurred, correct? From your investigation?
Are you speaking about the family?
No, I'm speaking about law enforcement officers. A
Oh.
lot of uniformed officers,
Absolutely, yes.
and they were mostly gone by the time you got there?
No, because what had happened was as they responded to the scene, I mean, the logistics of 50 plus police cars, you can't just, some people just can't immediately leave because they're dependent on others moving their vehicles. So there was a line of marked LMPD cars all down that street, leading up to that gate that was breached in the incident.
Okay. Well, it sounds like there were shell casings all over the place also, correct?
So there's shell casings immediately exterior, immediately south of apartment 4. Yes.
You testified yesterday, I believe, about a number of shell casings that have been related to LMPD officers who fired. And you, I believe, also testified there were a number of old shell casings around also.
Correct.
Do you know approximately how many total shell casings were recovered right around 3003 Springfield?
In relation or not in relation to the shooting?
Total.
I'd have to reference the CSU reports, but it was numerous.
Like 50 or 100, or do you know?
If you include the casings that were in the breezeway and the LMPD casings that were in the breezeway and in the parking lot, there was 10 casings in the parking lot not associated to the shooting, and there was 22 in the breezeway, and then one in the foyer opening the door.
Okay.
But there was, as you stated, and I'm agreeing with you, that there was weathered or other casings not associated to the incident.
And you don't know how many of those were around?
Again, I could reference the report if you'd like.
Well, could you do it in a second, or is it going to take you a while? Because it's not that important. Was it?
There was numerous.
Okay. Well, again, is numerous 100 or is it
No,
10?
it's maybe 8 if I guessed.
Okay.
But I have that right there, but
Okay.
if time's an issue.
Would you agree with me that, first of all, when a weapon is discharged, a semi-automatic weapon is discharged, that's what LMPD carries, correct?
Yes.
Semi-automatic pistol. When that is discharged, what happens with the casing that the bullet came out of?
It discharges from the right side of the weapon, and if the weapon is at somewhat of a 90-degree angle, it would discharge to the right and rear of that weapon.
And does it discharge automatically? The officer doesn't have to do anything to make it discharge, correct?
If there's not a malfunction in the handgun, if there's lots of variables, yes, it will discharge by itself.
And when those casings are discharged, do they end up in a little pile at the officer's feet?
No.
What happens with them?
Really, anything's possible.
They go all over the place,
They go all over
right?
the place, yes.
Okay. And then when they're on the ground and there are a lot of people around, they can be kicked around too also, correct?
Absolutely.
Now, you said when you arrived, you slowed everything down. I wrote that down yesterday, I think.
Correct.
What did you mean by that?
So one of the first things that PIU does when, like I said yesterday, when we go on scene, is that we want to try to one is remove all non-PIU personnel out of the scene unless we need uniform or plainclothes there to help us secure the scene. And I know I keep referencing secure the scene, but as we go about processing the scene, we don't want other LMPD members inside that scene that would, not prevent, but like inhibit us to do and come and go as we as we process the scene. So that's what I meant was removing uniformed officers from the scene, speaking about this incident, and slowing everything down, and specifically notating, whether it be just physically observing the scene. I'm speaking not just by myself, but other PIU investigators. Physically notating some obvious defect, obvious evidence, ballistic evidence, whatever it is, and taking an overall in that scene is what that consists of.
I think yesterday you also mentioned that there are lots of emotions among the officers. Is that correct?
In every officer involved shooting up that I've investigated, which is between 30 and 40, in 5 years that I, because PIU, Public Integrity, also investigates other jurisdictions or other police departments within Jefferson County. But every officer involved shooting that I've ever investigated, typically officers, not just the officers involved, but other officers are typically, their emotions are high because of the obvious critical incident that just occurred. So yes.
In officer-involved shootings, critical incidents can involve either an officer shooting somebody or an officer being shot, correct?
Correct.
And when an officer is shot, brother and sister officers are also very emotional about that. Is that a fair statement on my part?
It is.
Okay. Now, you indicated PIU, that's you, right? Public Integrity Unit?
At the time this incident was, yes.
And PIU does a criminal investigation, or it's referred to as a criminal investigation of the officers who discharged their weapons and any other officers that may have been involved, correct?
And not just the officers, we handle both sides of it. So if there's a civilian that commits a crime during that officer-involved shooting, we would investigate that as well.
Okay. And then CSU is the crime scene unit, is that what that stands for?
Yes,
And they come up and process the scene, correct?
at our discretion.
And you called them into 3003 Springfield, I presume?
Yes.
And do you know what time they arrived?
So, it would be sometime before 05:21 hours, because that's when we started video, and that's the first process in the scene processing. We take no audio, just a strict video without audio, video recording of the scene, and then that's how we begin our scene process.
So that would have been approximately 5 hours after the actual incident, correct?
Yeah, close.
And by that time, there had been multiple officers and people in and out of the scene?
No. So when I arrived, and I believe that me and Sergeant Wilder arrived pretty close to each other, that's when, like I testified, Sergeant Lee was there momentarily. He had already ascertained some information. So what we did was we removed everyone from the scene that was not a part of the PIU unit. So from that point forward, other than, as I recall, other than one uniformed officer that was standing in the breezeway, and we had uniformed officers on the outside of the police tape, trying to secure that area, preventing people from coming in. But we attempted to keep all LMPD personnel out of that scene.
When did you leave the scene, do you know?
Would have been sometime like almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
So were you there the entire time that CSU was there?
I absolutely was.
Okay. Well, I think you testified yesterday that some of Kenneth Walker's family came to the scene. That was right about the time you arrived. Is that correct, or were they already there?
I think that yes, I think it was pretty close to when I arrived, because obviously they had already been notified of it. They probably got notified of it before I did.
And how about any of Breonna Taylor's relatives?
So during the course of the conversation with Mr. Walker's family, they contacted Mrs. Palmer by phone, and then they arrived. Well, it'd be a guess, maybe 10 or 15 minutes later.
And you kept them out of the scene, correct?
We did.
Were they ever granted access to it? to your knowledge?
Not until the scene was released around 1:30 in the afternoon.
Of March 13th, correct?
Yes.
And when I say granted access, you let them go into the apartment, correct?
So part of the police department's responsibility is they don't want to, police departments don't just release property. And in this case, the individuals that either occupied the property were deceased or were in police custody. So it would be inappropriate for the police department to just leave a property open to allow it to, or subject it to potential theft or whatever. So during a communication process with Ms. Palmer, I told her that I would contact her when we conclude this scene investigation and let her come back and secure the apartment. And a part of that, we actually contacted the apartment complex management, and they contacted an LMPD member, Officer Donovan Duncan, who is a courtesy officer there at the community. So he was there, and the two, property management personnel, and Ms. Palmer, and a couple other family members, if I recall.
And that was at 1:30 in the afternoon?
Somewhere around there, yes.
Okay. Now, you recovered a total of 10 casings that you related to Brett Hankison's weapon, correct?
Spent casings, yes.
Spent casings, yes. And I believe you testified that CSU, I guess it was CSU, recovered 6 bullets that they related to Brett's gun, correct?
So we recovered more projectiles than that, but associated to the defendant's handgun was the 6 projectiles we spoke about.
That were recovered by LMPD.
During the scene process, PIU investigators identified and/or CSU technicians. So typically what happens is, as PIU investigators, if it's obvious evidence, we're going to put a marker down. If it's out sitting on carpet or laying on carpet, we put a marker down, photograph it, collect it. But as we went through the apartment and identified evidence that wasn't obvious to just a casual eye, we would stop, call a CSU tech, photograph it, and the CSU tech would collect it in the manner that they collect evidence.
To your knowledge, were any of the bullets that were recovered, none of them came from Breonna Taylor's body, correct?
No.
And it's been determined to your knowledge that none of Brett Hankison's bullets made contact with Breonna?
Yes.
Okay. And it was my understanding correct, I think you testified that later on, some months later, the FBI came and recovered additional bullets that were attached to Brett Hankison's weapon, correct?
Yes, and if I may speak about that.
Sure.
So the FBI came in, I'm not sure when, I wasn't a part of it. They actually just took down structure, which is not typical. I can say this is the only case in my 16 years of working for LMPD, and of the 16 years, 13 of those years, I've been in an investigative position. I've never seen structure removed to the point, as it was in this case, to collect projectiles.
Okay. You indicated that apartment 4, that's Breonna Taylor's apartment, was searched completely, I think you said, by
Yes.
CSU, correct?
CSU and PIU investigators.
CSU and PIU. And I think you used the term, you methodically went through the apartment, correct?
Correct.
In your investigation, did you later, well, first of all, you're not aware of an AR-15 rifle or any kind of rifle being recovered in apartment 4, correct?
No, there was not an AR-15 rifle in that apartment.
Okay. But Brett Hankison told you that during his statement we just watched, that he perceived that there was an AR being fired at the officers at the door, correct?
Correct.
Did you later learn in your investigation that, well, first off, what kind of ammunition does an AR-15 fire?
It could be 2.23 or 5.56, but it's high velocity ammunition.
223 being a caliber, correct?
Yes, yes.
Did you later learn during your investigation, or at some time in your investigation, learn that a .223 spent casing had been recovered in Janiyah Palmer's bedroom?
I was later told, after PIU was removed, I wouldn't say removed, but after PIU had completed their portion of this incident, investigation, this incident, that a spent casing was brought to the FBI by a civil attorney that was, they stated was found inside apartment 4.
Inside, well, I'm sorry?
Apartment 4.
Apartment 4, and that's Breonna Taylor's apartment. Do you know specifically it was found in Breonna Taylor's sister's bedroom?
I didn't know that. I just knew that I was told it was found in an apartment. They didn't specify like where.
And was that the bedroom through the window, the bedroom window that, was the window that Brett Hankison fired through the window to that bedroom?
So if it came from the sister's bedroom, yes, then that would have been the bedroom.
Thank you. You also mentioned during your testimony that you found bullet holes in the ceiling of apartment 4, correct?
Yes, so the two defects in the ceiling were in the transitioning from, it's almost like they were parallel to this. So if you're standing in the door and you look, if you were to take a gun and you go straight up, it would be in direct line with someone standing in the door and shot into the ceiling at that angle. If that makes sense.
And those bullets went through the ceiling of the Breonna Taylor apartment into the apartment above it,
8.
and then through the ceiling of that apartment, through the attic and out the roof.
At least one of them went through the roof. That's what I was told.
Okay. And you said, I think, that those were determined or to have been fired by Sergeant John Mattingly, correct?
I think it's likely that, I don't think I can say definitively, but it was likely that based off his account of his shooting, that they were associated to his shots he fired.
Was apartment 8 occupied by anybody
It was,
at the time of the shooting?
yes.
Has anybody been charged with reference to firing into that apartment with wanton endangerment?
I'm not aware of it.
Okay. You also testified with reference to the statement that Brett Taylor provided to you. I keep saying Brett Taylor, I mean Brett Hankison. That you follow the force science model. Can you explain a little bit to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the force science model is?
So Force Science is a company that's done exhaustive research, peer-reviewed research in critical incidents of law enforcement, and not just different aspects of critical incidents, and have come up with data, if you will, that measures all kinds of different data points as far as human motion within that incident. And also as far as like the cognitive part of it. So as far as like how officers recall things and what is conducive to get or obtain as much information from officers in critical incidents. Done exhaustive, over 20 years of research. So we follow that model based on the data that they've collected that's peer reviewed. It's confirmed, if you will. And we do that to ascertain as much about the incident as we can from the officers. Because immediately, if you were to get a consensual interview immediately after an incident, you take a chance of the officer, obviously because it's a critical incident, not recalling all the pertinent facts of the shooting. So 2 sleep cycles, and in this case, there was other factors. There was an injured officer, and an attorney represented all 3 of them, so we were dependent on scheduling. There was, it was up to them, so we went by their schedule, and that's why there was a delay, if you will, of 12 days between the incident and when the interviews occurred.
And Brett Hankison showed up whenever the arrangements were made and gave the statement we just watched, correct?
Correct.
And your experience in the force science model indicates that you would get a more accurate statement sometime after the incident rather than right within hours of the incident, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's change gears here for just a minute. During the course of your investigation, did you learn that Brett Hankison continued to perform police-related duties?
Yes, so as part of reviewing the enormous amount of body cam footage, I did not personally review all of it. I reviewed some of it. Every investigator in public integrity unit worked on this case for months, some for, beyond 6 months. But yes, I did review body cam footage or wearable video, and I was made aware through those video recordings of some of the actions that the defendant took.
Did you learn that he put out the initial radio broadcast of an officer shot and letting other people know, the people specifically on Elliott?
Yes.
And did you learn that he called for the EMS unit?
Yes.
And did you learn that he called for officers with long guns?
Yes, he articulated on the radio that there was a rifle involved to responding officers.
And does LMPD standard operating procedure policies require that if you have a barricaded subject with a weapon that you should bring long guns and set up a perimeter around the area?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware that it specifically says that. I think the policy states that SWAT should be contacted. Is that what you mean?
Well, do you know if there's a policy about long guns with the LMPD?
I'm sure there is, but sitting here, I don't remember exactly what it is. So if you're referencing like when a long gun it's appropriate for a long gun to be deployed, it would be in a situation like that, if that's what you mean.
Well, that's what I mean, but I also am asking you if you're familiar with the policy of LMPD that requires that long guns be deployed in a situation like that.
Yes.
And Brett Hankison called for long guns, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
I didn't want to say, I couldn't recall verbatim what the policy stated, and that's why I said what I said.
Okay. And I think you testified, or are you aware, as Brett Hankison testified in his statement we just saw, that he actually took a photograph of 3003 Springfield Drive and texted it to Sergeant Fan on Elliott?
Yes, he communicated that to Sergeant Fallon, yes.
And then when did you discover in your investigation that Brett Hankison directed the first officer with a marked unit on the scene to ram the gate?
Yes.
That was Brett Hankison that did that, correct?
Yes.
And did you discover that Brett Hankison directed responding officers to set up a perimeter around the building, including the rear of it?
Yes.
And you know that, and I think you testified, Brett Hankison was involved in calling Kenneth Walker out of the apartment, correct?
Correct.
And Kenneth Walker was called out of the apartment without any injury being inflicted on him, correct?
Correct.
And Brett Hankison assisted in handcuffing him, correct?
Correct.
And then, I think during your investigation, did you discover that Brett Hankison actually walked up to the door of apartment 4 after SWAT had arrived?
Yes, he walked through the threshold and spoke with Sergeant Hogan.
And do you know what he was talking to Sergeant Hogan about?
He was asking about a weapon.
He was asking about a weapon, and didn't he also ask if there was a dead person inside?
Yes.
And were you aware that he had been told by Kenneth Walker as he called him out that Breonna Taylor had discharged the weapon with the bullet that hit Sergeant Mattingly?
Yes.
So would it be logical in your mind that he might want to confirm or figure out whether Kenneth Walker was telling the truth?
Yes.
And then you learned, I believe, that Brett Hankison went to the University of Louisville Hospital, correct?
Correct.
And I understand that it's probably proper policy and procedure for an officer involved in a shooting to immediately go to PIU, correct? Or
It is policy.
be taken to
Yeah,
PIU.
he's supposed to be escorted by peer support.
And do you know when Brett Hankison was ever contacted by peer support?
I didn't physically witness that. I know that he had contact with a peer support commanding officer at the hospital.
At the
But
hospital?
on scene, I did not witness him physically make contact with peer support.
Do you find any fault with Brett Hankison going to the U of L hospital to check on his brother officer and his friend John Mattingly before he went to PIU?
I do. I think it's important for the process in critical incidents that he or she, the officer, speaking of the officer, follow the procedure, the peer support, get an escort, and is taken back to the public integrity unit. But as PIU, and I want to explain this, PIU investigators, we cannot be put in administrative row. Although we are commanding officers on the department, we are there to investigate the criminal investigation. We don't like to be put in positions where we have to act as a administrative sergeant, if that makes sense, where you're telling officers, you're giving them direct orders. So you're kind of flipping over to that other side, if you will.
So, yeah, somebody at the hospital probably or obviously told him to respond to PIU, correct?
Yes,
And to your knowledge, he did that.
yes.
And at PIU, what happened there?
So typically, what should happen is the involved officers are taken back to the public integrity unit. They're photographed. They have an attorney present. They have a peer support escort with them the whole time. There's probable cause to remove their clothing for evidentiary purposes or anything. That's done. Their weapons are collected as evidence. Their their projectiles or their bullets, their unspent ammunition's collected. Their magazines are collected. They're photographed head to toe. If it's applicable, their gun belts taken, their weapon mounted lights taken, their taser might be taken. It just depends on the scenario of the critical incident.
And all that was done with Brett Hankison, correct?
Yes.
And then he's sent home? Or
He would consult with his attorney and FOP, and maybe not in the public integrity unit, but I'm not sure what they would do because it's outside of my scope of what my responsibilities are.
Sergeant, are you familiar with LMPD standard operating procedure reference to conduct unbecoming?
Speaking of specifically what?
Speaking of,
The entire policy?
well, speaking of one of the subsections of the policy is that conduct unbecoming, or there's a special word, cowardice, that is conduct unbecoming, correct?
Correct.
And cowardice refers to cowardice of an officer to do his duty and be present and do things, correct?
Yes, it's to act when he's lawfully required to, yes.
And your investigation revealed that while Brett Hankison was not tending to John Mattingly, he was doing all kinds of other police-related activities right after that shooting, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Anything on redirect?
Moment.
I'm sorry?
When you were on the scene at 3003 Springfield, did you find Brett Hankison's flashlight? Or did you find a flashlight on the hood of a car?
I don't recall that. It could have been on Detective Cosgrove's car. Is that what you're referencing?
Well, no, in the statement, Brett said that he put his flashlight on the hood of a car or the trunk of a car in order to direct fire if it was going to come from inside the apartment toward that rather than toward officers in the parking lot. Did you personally find, or do you know if anybody found that flashlight?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Thank you.
Ms. Whaley?
Did you all find any AR-15 casings, as you said, a 223, anywhere in that apartment 4 that night?
No, ma'am.
Did you find any AR, now, if you're shooting an AR-15, I'm assuming there's bullets coming out of it, correct?
Yes.
So did you all find any AR-15 bullet defects anywhere in apartment 4?
There was no defects in any trajectories or shooting from east to west. That means from, the inside the residence to the entry door and beyond. There was no defect around the door of apartment 1 and that vinyl siding. There's no defect at all.
If an AR-15 was fired from the end of that hallway toward the front door, it's a powerful weapon, is it not?
It's a high velocity round, yes.
Did you find any evidence of AR-15 bullets in the breezeway, or as you said, the wall of apartment 1 across from apartment 4?
No.
And did you find any AR-15 bullets laying around?
No.
Did anyone get shot with an AR-15 that night?
No, ma'am.
The only bullet you all collected that was related to John Mattingly's being hit in the leg was the bullet you found by marker 37 that came from the 9mm under the bed in the south bedroom.
Correct.
Thank you.
Anything else of this witness?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you can step down. All right, Commonwealth's next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, it'll be Anthony Wilder.
If you'll take a seat, please. And if you'd raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, thank you.
Please state your name for the record.
Sergeant Anthony Wilder, Wilder.
And where do you work?
I'm employed with the Louisville Metro Police Department assigned to the Public Integrity Unit.
And how long have you been a police officer?
I've been with Louisville Metro 17 years this month.
And how long have you been assigned to the Public Integrity Unit?
4 years this month.
Do you have a certain role within that unit?
I'm the administrative sergeant for the Public Integrity Unit. I began in March of 2020 in that capacity. The 2 years before that, I was an investigator.
And what is the administrative sergeant's typical duties on a daily basis?
I deal with open records requests, scheduling for the investigators, other administrative duties, and then when there's a critical incident, I go and assist and respond and help coordinate resources and deal with the office primarily, making sure everybody gets in the office, interviews are running, and then I take care of what's called round counts typically, and conduct administrative paperwork on involved officers.
Okay. And on March 12th into March 13th of 2020, was there a critical incident that you responded to?
Yes, on Friday, March 13th at approximately 00:45 hours, I was made aware of an incident that happened at 3003 Springfield Drive.
Okay.
And I responded to that incident.
Okay. What does your response encompass?
Initially, I responded to the scene, was provided with an initial briefing. Once other members of the unit arrived, we shared information, and investigative tasks were assigned, and then I left the scene and returned to the office to carry out what would be my normal duties.
Okay. And not getting into what they said verbatim, but what information were you provided background-wise?
The initial information included that the CID, the Criminal Interdiction Division, had executed multiple search warrants that night. Several of them were in what's known as the First Division. And then there was a squad that was at the Springfield location tasked with executing a warrant in relation to this ongoing investigation. They had knocked and announced, got no response. They breached the door. Upon entry into the apartment, they were met by gunfire. Sergeant Mattingly had been struck in the leg, was subsequently transported to the hospital. And then the initial information was that Sergeant Mattingly and Detective Brett Hankison had returned fire in that situation.
How soon thereafter did you return to PIU?
I don't recall the specific time that I left the scene.
Okay. Do you know what time you got back to PIU, approximately?
It would have taken about 10 minutes, but I don't recall the specific time that I left or I returned.
Okay. When you arrived back to PIU, did you begin performing tasks in this case?
Yes, I continue to work relating to this case.
At some point, did the officers involved here arrive to your office?
Yes, witness officers and involved officers arrived at the PIU office. I check them in. If they have body cameras, I would collect them at that time, begin downloading video, and then start lining up people for interviews and coordinate that. As one interview gets done, I move the next person in. And then also in between that, conduct the round counts and other administrative paperwork.
Okay. And on that evening, did you have the role of overseeing, I guess, the intake or the forms that would go along with the intake to Detective Brett Hankison?
I did.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as exhibits 1 all the way from 109 to 119. Have you take a look at these. And are those a fair and accurate depiction of that night as you were the PIU sergeant intake with Detective Hankison?
They are.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to admit 109 through 119 and then display to the jury.
No objection.
They'll be so admitted.
Okay. Sergeant Wilder, I'm going to have you just kind of go through it with us as I go through the pictures here. What is this picture depicting here?
As part of the procedure, we take what we call stand-up photographs, and it's just to document the appearance and the condition of the officer. So this is what he would have been wearing the night of the incident and his clothing. And it doesn't show in here, but typically there'd be a front view, then they would turn and there'd be a photo of each side and then their back. So we get all 4 sides.
And then on to Exhibit 110. What is this? Just a...
It's just a close-up to get the individual's face.
Okay. In his vest that's, I guess, on his chest right there, obviously the marking is on that. What is contained in that vest?
I don't recall that we specifically inventoried the vest, but I can see a flashlight, his police radio, and then you can see the yellow on his side. That's going to be a taser, and then he has ammunition pouches there on his front hip, and then on would be his right side, a handgun.
Okay. Exhibit 111, what is this?
It's just going to be a picture showing his legs and feet, lower half of his body.
Okay.
And that's just a close-up of his palms.
Okay, exhibit 112. Is there any reason why you take the palms?
It depends on the situation. If they had contact with an individual or something, there may be blood or evidence on their hands. And we'll just take, usually there'll be a photograph of both sides of their hands, just to document that. Or lack of.
Okay. Exhibit 113.
This would be a photograph of the service weapon that was previously seen on his side, and then it's just got a couple of the magazines with it.
And then what is to the right? It looks like little pocket holes or Plinko chips. What is that?
Yeah, that's just gonna be a plastic, what ammunition comes in out of the box, and we just use that to, a round count's literally what it sounds like. We unload and physically count the ammunition, and so that it just doesn't roll over the place, we put it in that plastic container to hold it, and then a picture is taken of it.
Okay. And is there any reason why there's only one depicted in that?
In that particular photo, that one single round would typically be the round that was in the chamber when the gun was unloaded.
So in securing the weapon, that's where that comes from?
Yes.
Exhibit 114.
It's just another view of the gun, and then it's got the name of the officer and his code number to identify, whose weapon that is during that series of photographs.
And what type of gun is this that we have depicted here?
That's going to be a Glock 22 40 caliber.
And is that standard for officers in the LMPD?
Yes. Early on, the 40 caliber was all that LMPD would carry, with some exceptions prior to merger. Officers might have a Sig Sauer, but otherwise the Glock 40 was the standard weapon. Now there's a transition to Glock 9mm.
Okay. At this time, though, this is the gun that the officer was carrying?
Yes.
Exhibit 115 is just this, the reverse?
It's the other side of the gun, and then you can see on the serial number for the weapon on the frame, and then right above it, that's going to be the barrel. So it's the serial number twice.
And the serial number links it to the owner in this case?
Yes, it's just the way to identify the gun.
Okay. Exhibit 116.
And that's the serial number in a different place on the bottom of the gun, under the frame.
Exhibit 117, what are we looking at here?
This would be one of the ammunition magazines, and it's got the one that was shown earlier with the single round, and then the magazine and another round. So this would be the one that was taken out of the gun when it was unloaded. So the round that came out of the chamber, and then the 14 rounds that would have been in the magazine. And these magazines have a capacity of 15 rounds.
Exhibit 118.
This is another magazine, and you can see this one's got, there's numbers, so as bullets are in there, you can see the holes will be filled up, and it gives you an estimate of how many bullets are in the magazine. So the photo's taken this way to show that it's empty, and then there were 5 rounds out of that magazine.
And then exhibit 119.
That's the third magazine that was on Detective Hankison, and it had 14 rounds in it.
Okay. And when you document all these photos, what do you do next?
So the photos are a visual representation, and then there's a internal form that we call a round count form that we use to to write this down as well. And then I also write an investigative report that will document this information as well.
Okay. In this case, based on when you've actually ejected the magazines and taken the round count, how many rounds are unaccounted for in this case?
So when we do a round count, it's only as accurate as the information that we're given by the officer. So we'll ask what an officer typically carries, and we call that the loadout, so that we have a starting point. And then after we count, we subtract, and the difference would be, we would assume, is the number of rounds fired by the officer. On some occasions, the officers aren't aware of how many rounds they started with. So in this case, we determined that the round count was 44, and we accounted for 34. So we believe that 10 rounds had been discharged during the incident.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to show you now what has been marked as Commonwealth's Exhibit number 120. Have you take a look at this. Does that accurately, fairly depict the form that you witnessed get processed that evening when it comes to Detective Hankison?
Yeah, this is what the standard round count form. It includes the incident information, the officer's information, and then it has places to account for a handgun, a shotgun, or rifle, or the taser, and then it also has a diagram to mark if there's any injuries sustained by the officer. On this particular case, there was a new investigator to the unit, and I was just showing him how the round count process was conducted, and he assisted me, and he filled out the form, but I was there and communicated with Detective Hankison during the round count.
So this form actually had two set of eyes on it.
Yes.
Now, in that form, you mentioned the loadout count. What is the loadout count that you all processed?
It's written on here, 44 is the loadout count.
Okay, and then, go ahead, sorry. What is next on the sheet?
It would just be a breakdown by magazine of what the rounds were, and then there's a spot at the bottom where we add that up, and then you can just look at the difference. There's not actually a spot on the form where it says loadout, so it's handwritten off to the side, just for a documentation to know, so that you have a visual representation and know where you started at.
And based on that form, you said that the unaccounted number was 10 in this case?
Correct.
Okay. Now, when you spoke about talking to other officers, reference PIU in this case, that had discharged firearms, are you aware of those round count forms on the other two officers in the case? Were you present for those?
For Detective Miles Cosgrove, I completed that form, and then on Sergeant Mattingly, he had been transported to the hospital, so his weapon was secured and brought to the PIU office, and he was not physically present, so I just had his weapon and conducted the round count and then filled out the form.
And on those, do you know the round counts that would have been unaccounted for on each of those detectives?
On Detective Cosgrove, I believe the unaccounted for was 16, and for Detective or Sergeant Mattingly, I don't remember if it was written down, but I believe it would have been 5 or 6 because he wasn't present, so we didn't know if he started off with 15 or 16 rounds.
If I were to show you the report, would that refresh your memory?
Yes.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Down below, it's going to have each of the supplements for each officer.
Yeah, so 16 for Sergeant or for Detective Cosgrove, and then 6 rounds unaccounted for Sergeant Mattingly.
So all three officers in the case, though, went through the same process, of round count forms. All the weapons were secured and pictured.
Well, as I said, it was a little bit different because Sergeant Mattingly had been transported to the hospital, so he wasn't there, and the photographs weren't taken of him in this way. But the process would have been the exact same for Detective Miles Cosgrove.
And no other officers on that evening, to your knowledge, were discharged a firearm.
Based on the round count and preliminary information, no other officers had fired.
I think those are all the questions I have for you today, Sergeant Wilder. Thank you very much. I'll just come back and retrieve my report. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Wilder, I just have a few questions for you. You indicated that you collected body cameras from officers when you were at PIU, is that correct?
Yes, that's one of the tasks that I typically undertake.
Is it correct that none of the officers, the 7 officers who were on the scene serving the search warrant at 3003 Springfield, were wearing body cameras the night of this incident, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, there were none collected from them.
And to your knowledge, none of them were actually required to wear body cameras. Is that a fair statement?
At that time, the policy regarding body cameras was different. Yes,
If it happened tonight, they would have all had body cameras on, correct?
correct. The procedure would be different on today's day, yes.
When you were talking about the various weapons that officers carry, you used the term prior to merger. Can you explain to ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you were referring to there?
In 2003, Louisville Metro became an incorporated government, combining the city of Louisville and Jefferson County. Prior to that, the city of Louisville had a police department and Jefferson County had a police department. So there are some officers that were, employed prior to merger, and they would have different weapons, and those weapons were grandfathered in so that they could still continue to use them during their service.
So when you said prior to merger, you were talking about right before different police agencies came together, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's talk about the round counts for a minute. With reference to Brett Hankison, you said he had a weapon with a magazine in it, correct?
Correct.
The first photograph we looked at was, or not the first, but the first magazine that we looked at had 14 rounds in it?
Yeah, there was the one by itself and then 14 in the other container.
How many rounds does a magazine hold?
In that particular case, it was a standard ammunition magazine, so it would hold 15.
The magazine itself would hold 15?
Correct.
So if you loaded one into the chamber, there would be 14 left in the magazine, correct?
Correct. During that process, Detective Hankison had stated that he had done a tactical reload. So the magazine that had 5 was the one that was in his gun during the incident, and he had unloaded it and then reloaded a full magazine.
So when you actually got a hold of his weapon, it had a full magazine in it, correct?
Yes. So when you do the tactical reload, and we didn't discuss that, I don't know if there was a round already in the chamber when he dropped the magazine and reloaded it. So I don't know if the magazine he loaded had 14 rounds or not, because the other magazine that wasn't used had 14 rounds in it.
Okay, so you had 2 magazines that had 14 rounds,
Yes.
and the one that was not in the weapon, or one of the ones that was not in the weapon when you first received it, was the one that was partially full, correct? That would have had 5 rounds in it, I believe,
Yes.
which would be indicative of it having been dropped from the weapon and a full one put in it, correct?
Yes.
Thank you, nothing further.
Anything else of this witness?
Just one follow-up, Your Honor. If the magazine was fully loaded with 15, with one in the chamber, what would the total be on that?
If it is a full 15 and one in the chamber, you'd have 16. But like I say, the round count was 44, was the loadout. So 3 times 15 would be 45, and if you had one in the chamber, the maximum would be 46. So typically, we would expect the loadout to be 45 or 46. 44 is a little bit of an unusual number, but sometimes officers do carry 14 rounds. If it's a new magazine, the springs are very stiff. It's hard to get that last round in there, or they sit without being used, and that tension on the spring can cause a misfeed on some occasions. So sometimes people don't put the maximum amount in there. But based on the round counts and everything, I believe 44 is a very accurate loadout. We accounted for 34 rounds, which would leave 10 rounds unaccounted for.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Nothing further, Judge.
All right, you can step down, thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is probably a good time for us to go ahead and break for lunch. So why don't we break until 1:35, and that'll give you just about an hour for lunch. And please remember the separation admonition, and I'll see you back then. Thank you.